In this lesson, we're going to learn all about variables, specifically what exactly is a variable, and how to think about good variable names, and talk about some rules surrounding the variable names. We're going to take a little bit of a sidebar and talk about tracebacks, what exactly those are, and how to use that in debugging our code. Then we're going to talk about variables that you can't use. They're called keywords, and talk about some common gotchas with variables. And finally, talk about how do we inspect the values of variables using the print statement and also using Visual Studio Code. So let's get started. So to get us started, first off, I have Visual Studio Code opened up in my GitHub repository that I've created from the beginning of these lectures. And you'll see that I've got my hello.py file in here with all of my kind of code that I put in there that we did in the previous lesson. What I'm going to do first here is I'm going to create a folder in here, and I'm going to call it module 2, like this. And then inside of that module 2, I'm going to create another file, and I'm going to call this one variables.py. And we're going to use this file to talk about the different types of codes. We're going to start writing code right away and talk about what exactly these things are and how to work with them. And so now that we've done that, let's talk a little bit about what exactly is a variable. Well, variables are essentially assignments of a value to a name. So if we go back and we remember our previous lecture, we talked about the basic components of a computer. In memory, when we're operating a program, we have these sections of memory that are stored, set apart for execution and storing information. Well, we want to be able to access that information inside of that memory. And we do that by assigning a variable to that type of a value. So we use the variables to access these data points that are in there and for storage. And so we use and we create variables using the equal sign operator. So this is kind of right away when we talk about start getting into comparisons, and when you think about equals in mathematics, you think of equals as equality in there. And that's not really what's happening here. The equal sign is actually an assignment in there. So you're assigning a name to a specific chunk of memory. So here I've got this example of username being set to Chronos. So let's just do that. So I'm going to create in my file, I'm going to say username is equal to Chronos, like this, just like that. And that's it. That's all you have to do. You have now created a variable that's in there. We can come up with another one. Let's say we've got password, right? So maybe you're trying to do that. Well, let's use the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in there. Now, I don't have any passwords for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So all of you that are thinking and trying to hack me on all my accounts, you're going to have to work a little bit harder to try to get my passwords. But, this is a legitimate way. And it doesn't have to be a string. So we're using a string type here. And we'll talk about, kind of a little bit more, what are these types, but I could put in just straight up numbers in here. I've created a variable. Let's run this and just kind of see what happens. So I'm actually going to change directories into my module 2 in my terminal that I have pulled up here. So I'm going to cd module 2 like this. And then I'm going to say Python and variables.py. So Python is my executable, and then my file is what I'm passing in there. So I'm saying execute using Python, this Python file. I'm going to run this, and nothing happens. Now, there's another way to run this. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to click the run Python file in here, and there it runs, and we see nothing out there. Well, that's exactly what we would expect it to happen, actually, is nothing happened because we didn't tell it to output anything. And we'll talk about how we kind of go about doing that. But let's talk a little bit more about these variables. And the first thing I really want to iterate with you is picking the right user or your variable name and taking the time to think about that. So in Clean Code by Robert Martin, also known as Uncle Bob, he's a great person to follow. I would highly recommend following him on Twitter. I highly recommend his books, and even some of his videos that he's got there. And he's just a lot of fun to watch, but has some really good things. So in his book, he brings out these kind of core things to do when picking a variable name and writing them. You want it to reveal intent. And what that means is when you look at a variable and you see that variable name, you want to know what exactly is that variable going to be used for. If we go back to my Visual Studio Code, we know that this is a username. We know that this is a password. And then that's going to be used that. So when we look at these variables later on and throughout our execution of our code, we know exactly what those are intended to be representing as. And so when we need to debug them and look at their values, and if they don't look like a username or they don't look like a password, then we're going to try to figure out, well, why doesn't it look like that? One thing to realize is that it takes time to find a good name, but in the end, it'll save you time. And this is one of the biggest things that in the pitfalls that I've run into over my career as a programmer. I'll pick a variable name just to be whatever and kind of be funny sometimes. Sometimes I'm cute. But in reality, sometimes when I go back and look at my code, I have no clue what it's doing. And I just sit there and I stare at it and I'm wondering, and I'm the one that wrote the code and I still have no clue what's doing it. So it's really important to do that. Guido van Rossum actually said that code is more often read than executed. And I think that's kind of a wonderful thing to think about. In fact, that's why he created the Python programming language, was because he wanted to create something that was just really easy to read and understand and view, because he knew that a lot of these other programming languages were just kind of difficult to understand. And so that's why he created the Python programming language. The next thing you should think about is if a name requires a comment, and we'll talk about how to make a comment in a little while, but if it requires a comment or an explanation, then that's not really a good name. You shouldn't be using that. The length of the name should correspond to the size of its scope. And this isn't necessarily kind of easy to understand, but when I say scope, I mean how much within the script is it going to be used. For example, if we go back to this, if I've got username and password and I start doing some, executions here, and then down here all the way on line 50 is where I actually start using my username. So let's say I do, let's see, I'm going to do a check. So if username is equal to Chronos, right? Something like this. Okay. Don't worry about the if statements. Don't worry about what's going on. The point of the scope that we're talking about is I have to scroll all the way up here to understand what does username mean, or what is the value of username. And if I just have this as you, like this, and I'm down here, and now it's just you, then that becomes kind of not really interesting. Like I have a hard time understanding what this is. Maybe I've jumped in and looked straight at here. This is where the error code was, and now that doesn't make sense. So when we talk about scope, if something is going to be used further down in your script or in other modules or other scripts or packages, then make sure you name it the length of the name to be as clear as you need it to be. Now here's another example. I've created a for loop here. We'll talk about what for loops are, but this for loop creates a variable called I. And in this I, it's only going to be used within this for loop. So once this for loop executes, it's done. And so using an I like this, which is just a single character variable, it's a pretty common thing used in programming. You'll see I or J. It's okay to do that because this is the only place that this variable is intended to be used. Now, if I is going to be used elsewhere, then this should really be changed. Or if this fourth for loop is going to be quite extensively long, like maybe 5 or 6 or 10 lines long, then maybe we should reconsider what this variable name should be and think about that. So that's what it means by scope. So the length of the name should correspond to the size of its scope. The longer the scope, or the more often and further away from its declaration is a variable used, the really more clearer the variable name should be. And finally, choose clarity over entertainment value. Saying something like captain or captain's, captain in there for the username. He may be the captain of the program, but that's not really all that interesting. And when you go further down, it's not really understandable. Be as clear as you can be in there. So when you're choosing a variable name, it may take time, and you may find yourself looking like this and sitting there and wondering, what will I name this variable? In fact, I think quite possibly the hardest thing you'll ever have to do in programming isn't learning algorithms, isn't learning loops, isn't going to be learning how to work with object-oriented programming. It's going to be, what are you going to name your variables, your functions, your classes? Choosing a name is quite possibly one of the hardest things you'll have to do as a programmer. Here's some naming rules that you have. And this is not necessarily naming rules as in writing good names. This is naming rules as in what Python limits you to. So for example, variable names can be any length. And when I say any length, I mean truly any length. I created a script that would generate as many characters as it could. And in fact, I think I got up to 2 to the, I don't know, it was like 2 to the 100. It was like 4 billion something characters or something like that. And Python was able to generate that variable name using that 4 billion characters. Now, what it ran into was a memory error. So the limitation of the number of characters that you can use in a variable name is limited to your memory. Now, that may be kind of a funny type thing, but what you want to do is also not be so long that you have to side scroll for forever and ever and ever to understand what that means. For example, if I changed username of the running system that we only care about for our program, as you can see, this is just too much. This is way too long. So going back to our choosing the right name, truly can be as long as you want, but try to keep it as clear as possible. Variables can only use upper and lowercase letters, so A through Z, both capital and lowercase. They can use digits, so 0 through 9, and they can use underscores inside of them. The thing is they cannot start with a digit that's in there. So let's go back to this. I'm going to erase some of my statements here and go back to my original one. Now, I'm really going to start working with this and generating this. And if you'll remember, whenever we start with a file, we should always be starting with our main function. So if dunder name is equal to string dunder main, we're going to indent this by 1 level. We're going to have this in there. So possible variable names can be something like this, user 1. That's fine to do that. And that's going to be Chronos loaders in there. We could do something like this. Let's see, master password, like this. You see how there's an underscore in there? And we've done that to separate some words that are in there. We can set that equal to 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ha! I've tricked you and gone backwards instead of forwards this time. We could also kind of combine and start this with an underscore inside of there. Say we say master user, and that's going to be root, something like that. Now, one thing we can't do is we can't do with something with a number. So let's say 9 lives, like this, is equal to 9. That's in there. This isn't going to work. And in fact, let me run this and see what happens. Python variables.py. Whoops. Remember, we're going to cd into our module 2. Then Python variables.py. Run that, and we get an error. Now's a really good time for us to take that sidebar and talk about what is this error that we see here. I'm going to take this and I'm going to copy this into a new file. Whoops. There we go. So that we can actually analyze this a little bit further. So we look at this and analyze this. Let's think about this a little bit and let's see what Python has given us. I'm going to ask you a few questions. Which file did we encounter this error? Well, I certainly hope that it's variables.py, and indeed it is, because that's the file that I executed. Now, here's a good question. On which line was it? You'll notice right here is where it's selected. So we're talking about line 10. What exactly is the error that we encountered? The error is called a syntax error. Now, syntax error means that basically Python encountered something that isn't syntactically correct. And so that means that we broke the rules of its syntax. So for example, if we were to indent improperly, we get a syntax error. If we name our variables incorrectly, we're going to get a syntax error that's in there. If we do all sorts of different things specifically to the syntax, so the code wasn't able to fully execute because of that syntax, well, it's going to get it in there and it's going to raise a syntax error. Where or which column is this issue encountered? Well, that's a little bit more kind of tricky, but if you look at this line, lines 4 and 5 here, we have 9 lives, and then underneath this, there's an arrow. So this is saying that this is where things started to get interesting, and we started running into an error. So if we look at this 9 lives, we can see, hey, this truly is an invalid variable. It's got a 9 in the front. It can't start with a digit that's in there. So we're going to come back and change this to 9 lives in there. We're going to run our file again, and ta-da, everything worked perfectly fine. So that's debugging for you. I want to show you something else here, right here, a list of exceptions here. So Python has a set of built-in exceptions, and you can actually see what these different exceptions are and how they work. So here's a set of concrete exceptions. We have an assertion error. We have an EOF error, which is an end of file error. We have a floating point error. We have a module not found error, an index error, a key error, all sorts of different errors. This site right here, this URL that you're going to be running is going to be a really kind of helpful place for you whenever you run into an exception. You could pull this up and see exactly what does it mean for those errors. And so I would highly recommend that you save that URL for you to be able to use. Now let's talk a little bit about some variables that you can't use. And these are called reserved keywords. So reserved keywords have a very specific purpose inside of the Python space. So for example, false or none. And in fact, actually, this right here is the list of all the ones that you can't use. And if you try to, you'll actually get another error. And so let's try that. Let's say pass is equal to this is a test. And we should get an error with that. Because if we look back here and look at the keyword, pass is one of those keywords that's in there. So let's run this. Let's see what happens. Python variables.py, and ta-da, we get a syntax error. Invalid syntax right here. Because pass can't be assigned. We can't do that. So we're going to get rid of this and do that. If you really can't think of a keyword or of a variable that really just has to be something similar to a keyword, then put an underscore in front of it, or put an underscore in front of it. So pass is equal to something like that. Do that. But I would highly recommend, and never really in my entire life programming career have I encountered a situation where I have to use that keyword. Most of the time it ends up being something like this: pass for server, right? To represent a password for the server. Usually I should be putting more clarity into there if I'm using something like a keyword argument that's there. Let's talk about some of the common gotchas that you have with working with variables. Variables are case sensitive. So that means that if we have something like this, let's say print password like this. So we've got password up here all in lowercase, and we've got password right here with a uppercase P in there. Well, what's going to happen here? Let's find out. Let's see what happens. Oh, we get an error. Name error? What? This is a new one. What does this mean? Well, let's look at our traceback and find out. Which file was it in? Variables.py. Cool. Which line was it? 12. Okay, so let's look at this. Line 12. Oh, but wait. This isn't the issue that I thought I was going to run into. What is the specific error that we got? A name error. Well, pass for server is not defined. I'm not doing anything with this. I just threw a variable out there and I didn't do anything with it. We're going to talk about a little bit later on what operators are, but I needed to define what this is. And I'm going to say that this is the same thing as a master password. What have I done here? I've set a variable to another variable. And that's perfectly fine. So when you create a variable, it doesn't necessarily have to be a specific data type, concrete data type like these strings and integers. You can set them to other variables as well. So now that I've done that, now let's run my script. And now we get a different error, the same one we ran into before. But now this time, where is the line? Line 14. So line 14 right here. That's where we expected issues to happen. So case sensitivity is a very common gotcha. But another common gotcha that I threw at you without you realizing it is sometimes working with variables that haven't been defined yet. For example, that pass for server. So if I start doing something with it, but it hasn't been defined, then I'm going to run into that issue. Another common gotcha is using dashes in between, and dashes don't work. So remember, the rules are A through Z, both upper and lowercase, any digits, and underscores. That's all that can be inside of a variable name. With the exception of Unicode. And actually, you can, now that I think about this, you actually may be able to use dashes. In fact, let's try it out. Now that they've actually supported Unicode, this is, nope, this isn't gonna work. Kind of. So this isn't gonna work because we're using dashes instead of that. But you can use Unicode to do some really weird things in there. And you can use Unicode characters such as a dash Unicode character to put them in there. Now, I'm going to caution you, do not use Unicode as a beginner programmer. In fact, I'm going to caution you, do not use Unicode for variable names ever, unless you really want to just be kind of funny or you're doing something kind of fun. But if you're ever doing something professional, do not use Unicode as a variable name, because that is only going to cause you further heartache and effort than you'll ever want to deal with. Finally, let's talk about how to inspect variables and the values of variables using the print function. So going back to this, you saw me use this print function right here, and I passed in something that wasn't working. Let's finally pass in something that actually is defined. Now, what the print statement does, if you'll remember when we did our print hello world, what it does is it takes its input and outputs it to the terminal. The terminal being our PowerShell terminal, or it could be a Bash terminal if you're using a Mac, or ZSH if you're using the latest version of Mac. It could be whatever is kind of being output as far as the terminal goes. So let's run this and see what we get. So Python variables.py. Now remember, we're going to execute this coming down like this, and we're printing out password, and password is 1 2 3 4 5, and we see 1 2 3 4 5. So let's start playing around with this. Let's actually move this guy up here and do another print statement here of username. And ta-da, let's see how this works. Oh, we've got Kronos and 1 2 3 4 5. Well, that's pretty cool. Let's see what happens when we print our master password and then print our pass for server. So if you'll remember here, we've got our master password, which is 54321 as a string. And then we set this pass for server equal to master password. Let's see what this is going to print out and see what happens. So Python and then variables.py, we're going to run this. Our first print statement is our username, which is Kronos. Our second print statement is password, which is 1 2 3 4 5. Our second print statement is master password, which is 54321. Then finally, our next statement is pass for server, which is 54321. Now, that's pretty neat, and you're able to do that and work on that. So in today's lesson, we talked about what exactly is a variable, how to properly name the variable in not only Python related terms, but also in human related terms, in terms that makes it easier for both you and your users to be able to read and use your code. We talked about how to debug and looking at tracebacks for debugging. And then we also looked how to inspect variable files inside of a variable using the print statement in there. And so next up, what we're going to talk about is variable types, and talk about, well, what exactly is a type that's assigned to that variable. So see you in the next video.